Tom Hanks pulled his coat tighter around himself as he walked along the empty road. His face was tired, his steps slow but steady. He had been traveling for hours, looking forward to resting for the night. But then, his phone rang. At first, he thought about ignoring it. It was late, and unknown calls often meant trouble. But something made him answer. "Hello?" His voice was calm but firm. The voice on the other end was shaky. It belonged to a man, but he sounded frightened. "You need to get to the woods. There's a dog, tied up deep inside. You have to hurry." Tom's brows furrowed. "What? Who is this?" The man took a sharp breath. "There's no time. Just go. Please. Before it's too late." Then, the call ended. Silence filled the air, but Tom's heart was now racing. Most people would ignore such a call. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone was trying to scare him. But something in that man's voice felt real. The urgency. The fear. It wasn't just a warning, it was a desperate plea. Tom sighed, looking towards the dark trees. He could turn back, find a warm place to sleep, and forget this ever happened. But his gut told him otherwise. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that someone, or something, needed his help. With a determined breath, he turned off the road and stepped into the forest. The cold air wrapped around him, and the thick trees blocked out most of the moonlight. Every step he took made the dry leaves crunch beneath his boots. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. Then, in the distance, he heard it. A bark. Sharp, strained, and desperate. Tom stopped. His heart pounded. There really was a dog out here. He took another step, then another, following the sound. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, but the barking grew clearer, leading him forward. Something was wrong. This was not just a lost dog. Someone had left it here, tied up, alone, and afraid. And Tom had no idea that finding the dog was just the beginning. Tom pushed through the thick underbrush, his boots crunching against the fallen leaves. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence around him. Only his footsteps and the faint rustling of tree branches filled the air. Then, suddenly, a sharp bark cut through the quiet night. He froze. The bark was desperate and strained, coming from somewhere ahead. He raised his flashlight, scanning the dense forest. The beam flickered across twisted tree trunks and tangled vines, but there was no sign of the dog. He took a deep breath and moved forward, stepping carefully over fallen branches. Another bark. This time, closer. Tom's heart pounded as he reached a small clearing. His flashlight swept over the area, and then he saw it. A large German shepherd, tied tightly to a tree with thick rope. The dog's body was thin, and its fur was matted with dirt, but its eyes were sharp and alert. Despite its clear exhaustion, it stood tall, watching him intently. There was no panic, no struggle, just quiet observation, as if it was waiting for something. Tom's chest tightened. Who would do this? Why would someone leave a dog tied up in the middle of the forest? "Hey, buddy," he said softly, stepping closer. The dog didn't growl or flinch. It just kept staring, its deep brown eyes locked onto him. Carefully, Tom knelt beside it. The ropes were wound tightly around its body, digging into the fur. He pulled a pocketknife from his coat and began cutting through the restraints. As he worked, his eyes fell on the dog's worn leather collar. The material was cracked with age, but a name was still visible, etched into the surface. Kaiser. Tom traced the name with his fingers, and a strange chill ran down his spine. It felt familiar, but he couldn't place why. The name stirred something in the back of his mind, like a half-forgotten memory trying to resurface. The last knot came loose, and the ropes fell away. The dog was free. But instead of running, Kaiser simply stood still. Tom expected him to shake off the ropes, maybe even bolt into the trees, but the German Shepherd did none of that. He stretched his legs slightly, but his eyes never left Tom's face. It was almost as if he was waiting for orders. Tom swallowed hard. Something about this wasn't right. This wasn't a lost or abandoned dog. This was a trained K9. And if Kaiser was trained, then whoever left him here did it for a reason. Tom had a sinking feeling that finding this dog was no accident. He had just stepped into something much bigger than he realized. Tom walked carefully through the dark forest, his footsteps slow and steady. Kaiser moved beside him, his posture strong, his eyes sharp. The dog was completely silent, no panting, no whining, no hesitation. It was almost as if he had done this before, as if he knew exactly how to move without making a sound. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the branches above them. It made the forest feel alive, whispering in the darkness. But something else was bothering Tom. It wasn't just the wind. It was the feeling of being watched. Every few steps, he glanced over his shoulder. The trees swayed, their shadows stretching across the ground. His flashlight flickered as he scanned the area, but he saw nothing. Still, the uneasy feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. Kaiser's ears perked up, his head turning slightly. He had sensed it too. Tom tightened his grip on the flashlight and quickened his pace. Whatever was out there, he didn't want to find out. He just needed to get back to safety. Finally, he reached his small cabin on the edge of town. He let out a slow breath, locking the door behind them. Kaiser stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, still on high alert. Even though they were out of the forest, the dog didn't relax. Tom set his flashlight down and pulled out his laptop. He had to find out who this dog really was. He typed in the name he had seen on the collar, Kaiser. Missing K9. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual. Just random pages about dog training. But then, a report caught his eye. Police K9, Kaiser, missing in action. Tom's eyes widened as he clicked on the link. The article was 3 years old. It described a highly trained police dog who had vanished during a dangerous operation. The case had been big news at the time. The police had searched for weeks, but Kaiser had never been found. Until now. Tom leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a lost dog. Kaiser had been presumed dead. Yet here he was, alive, trained, and tied to a tree in the middle of a forest. Who had kept him all this time? And why abandon him now? His mind raced with possibilities. Was Kaiser stolen? Had he been used for something illegal? Kaiser lay down on the floor, resting his head on his paws. But his eyes stayed open, watching Tom carefully. Tom exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. He had found this dog by accident, or at least, that's what he had thought. Now, he wasn't so sure. Because if Kaiser had returned after 3 years, it meant someone out there wasn't done with him yet. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Tom sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. The old article about Kaiser was still open, the words repeating in his mind. A missing police K9, vanished for 3 years. Now, suddenly found in the middle of the forest. It didn't make sense. Kaiser lay on the floor beside him, his body still, his eyes half closed. He looked relaxed, but Tom had noticed something: the dog never fully slept. His ears twitched at the smallest noise. His muscles stayed tense, ready to move. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees, rattling the windowpane. Tom yawned, rubbing his eyes. He needed sleep, but his thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Then, Kaiser lifted his head. His ears perked up, his body stiffening. A low, deep growl rumbled from his throat. Tom froze. "What is it, buddy?" he whispered. Kaiser stood up, his gaze locked on the front door. His growl grew louder, his fur bristling. Tom grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the door, his heartbeat quickening. He pressed his ear against the wood. Silence. But he knew someone was out there. Slowly, he turned the lock and cracked the door open. The cold night air rushed in, making him shiver. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the porch, the trees, the empty street. Nothing. Tom stepped outside, his breath visible in the icy air. His gut told him something was wrong, but there was no one in sight. Maybe it was just his imagination. Then, as he turned back toward the house, he saw it. A piece of paper, taped to the windshield of his car. The paper flapped slightly in the wind, barely holding on. Tom's stomach dropped. He ripped it off and held it under the porch light. The message was written in thick, uneven letters, as if someone had scribbled it in a hurry. "Leave the dog where you found him." Tom's grip on the paper tightened. A cold wave of realization hit him. Whoever had tied Kaiser up in the forest hadn't just abandoned him. They had been using him. And now, they wanted him back. Tom looked over his shoulder, scanning the shadows. His pulse pounded in his ears. Someone had come this close to his home, and they had been watching. Kaiser stood in the doorway, still growling, his sharp eyes locked on the darkness beyond the porch. Tom stepped back inside and locked the door. His mind raced. He had thought he had saved Kaiser. But now, it was clear. The real danger was only beginning. Tom sat at his desk, staring at the note in his hand. "Leave the dog where you found him." The words repeated in his mind like an echo. Whoever had left Kaiser in the forest hadn't abandoned him. They had been using him. He needed answers. Taking a deep breath, Tom picked up his phone and searched for Detective Laura Simmons, the officer who had investigated Kaiser's case 3 years ago. After a few rings, a tired voice answered. "Detective Simmons speaking." Tom hesitated for a moment. Then, he spoke. "My name is Tom Hanks. I think I've found something, or someone. A police K-9. His name is Kaiser." The line went silent. Then, Simmons' voice returned, sharper, more alert. "Kaiser?" She paused. "That dog disappeared years ago." "Are you sure?" Tom glanced at the German shepherd lying near his feet. "I'm sure." There was another pause before Simmons sighed. "Where did you find him?" Tom explained everything, the phone call, the forest, the strange note left on his car. The more he spoke, the more Simmons' tone changed from curiosity to concern. "Listen to me carefully," she said. "If Kaiser is alive, you need to be very careful. That dog didn't just go missing, he was taken." Tom frowned. "Taken? By who?" Simmons exhaled. "A criminal ring. They were involved in illegal activities, drug smuggling, underground fights, even high-risk security operations. They stole highly trained dogs like Kaiser and used them." Tom felt a chill run through him. "Used them for what?" "For whatever they needed," Simmons said. "Guarding shipments. Tracking people. Even attacking targets." Tom looked down at Kaiser. The dog had been silent the whole time, but now, his eyes were locked on Tom, watching, waiting. As if he understood. "Some of those stolen K-9s were never found," Simmons continued. "And the people who took them? They don't let their assets go." Tom clenched his jaw. Kaiser wasn't just a missing dog. He was part of something bigger. "So, if Kaiser escaped," Tom said slowly, "or if they threw him away, why?" There was a long silence. Then, Simmons spoke in a grim voice. "That's the question you need to answer before they come looking for him." Tom's grip tightened on the phone. He had thought finding Kaiser was a rescue. But now, it was clear, Kaiser's past was dangerous. And if his former owners wanted him back, they would do anything to get him. Tom drove through the empty streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The sky was dark, and the roads were quiet, but his mind was racing. Everything led back to this place, an old warehouse where Kaiser's unit had last operated. If he wanted real answers, this was where he had to go. Beside him, Kaiser sat still, his sharp eyes watching the road ahead. He hadn't relaxed since the night they found the note. He was trained to sense danger, and Tom could feel the same unease creeping into his chest. As the warehouse came into view, Tom slowed the car. The building was massive, its metal walls rusted and covered in graffiti. A broken fence surrounded it, the gate hanging open. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. He parked outside and stepped out cautiously. Kaiser jumped down beside him, his ears twitching. The wind whistled through the gaps in the warehouse walls, creating an eerie, hollow sound. Then, Kaiser stopped. His body stiffened. His tail went rigid. And then he let out a deep, warning bark. Tom's pulse quickened. They weren't alone. He scanned the area with his flashlight, but nothing moved. Still, he knew better than to ignore Kaiser's instincts. Something was here. Watching. Swallowing hard, Tom moved forward, gripping the flashlight tighter. The warehouse door was unlocked. He hesitated for a moment. It felt too easy. Almost like someone was expecting him. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The metal creaked loudly as it swung inward. Dust filled the air, and the faint smell of rust and oil clung to the walls. Inside, broken crates and empty shelves lined the space. Tom stepped inside, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. Kaiser followed closely, his nose sniffing the air. Then, Tom's flashlight landed on something that made his stomach twist. A table, covered in photographs. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. Every photo was of Kaiser. Some showed him as a police K-9, working in his unit. Others were newer, taken in different locations. Someone had been watching him. Next to the photos were detailed records, papers listing Kaiser's abilities, training, and previous handlers. Someone had been keeping track of him all these years. Then, Tom saw something else. A rusted key, sitting in the center of the table. The words, K9OPS, were engraved into the metal. He reached for it. But before he could pick it up, bang! The warehouse door slammed shut. The lights flickered, and Kaiser let out a sharp bark, his body tense. Tom spun around, his heart hammering. He was trapped. And whoever had set this up, was coming for them. Tom's breath came fast and uneven. The warehouse door had slammed shut. Someone was out there, and they wanted him trapped. Kaiser stood beside him, muscles tense, ears perked. He let out a deep growl, his eyes locked on the shadows beyond the dimly lit room. He knew danger was close. Then, footsteps. Fast. Sharp. Getting closer. Tom didn't have time to think. He needed to get out. He looked around quickly, searching for an exit. The main doors were locked. The windows were too high. Then, he spotted something, a rusted service tunnel at the back of the warehouse. "Kaiser, let's go," he whispered. He sprinted toward the tunnel, his heart pounding. Kaiser followed without hesitation, moving low and fast. Behind them, the footsteps quickened. The sound of voices echoed in the dark. "They're in here," someone shouted. Tom didn't look back. He reached the tunnel door and yanked it open. A damp, narrow passage stretched ahead, leading underground. The air smelled of rust and mold. No time to hesitate. He ducked inside, Kaiser slipping in behind him. As soon as they entered, a gunshot rang out. Bang! The bullet struck the metal doorframe, missing Tom by inches. He slammed the tunnel door shut and ran. The tunnel was long and dark, lit only by the flickering glow of Tom's flashlight. He could hear the distant clang of boots as their pursuers tried to break through. They weren't giving up. Kaiser took the lead, his nose twitching, his pace steady. He wasn't just running, he was guiding. His training had kicked in. He knew where to go. Go, boy, Tom urged, following him deeper into the tunnel. Behind them, the tunnel door burst open. The sound of footsteps echoed closer. Tom pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his legs. This wasn't just about a missing dog anymore. Kaiser wasn't just a stolen K9. He wasn't just another case. He knew something. And whoever had taken him wanted that secret buried. Tom's mind raced. What had Kaiser been used for in the past 3 years? What had he seen? Why was he worth chasing down? They reached the end of the tunnel. A metal grate blocked the exit. Tom shoved it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. Kaiser, help me. The dog leapt up, using his powerful body to push against the grate. With one final shove, it gave way, crashing to the ground outside. They scrambled through, emerging into the open night. Tom turned back just in time to see the shadows closing in. They weren't done. And neither was he. Tom ran, his breath heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. Kaiser sprinted beside him, his body tense, his ears alert. Behind them, the sound of pursuing footsteps and low voices filled the air. They had made it out of the tunnel, but the chase wasn't over. Ahead, the town's edge came into view, a stretch of empty road, lit only by distant streetlights. Nowhere left to run. Tom turned, gripping a metal pipe he had picked up from the warehouse. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. Kaiser growled low, his sharp eyes locked on the shadows moving toward them. Then, from the darkness, a man stepped forward. He was tall, dressed in black, his face partially hidden beneath a hood. But his voice was cold and clear. "Give us the dog, Mr. Hanks. Walk away, and you won't get hurt." Tom's grip tightened on the pipe. "Not happening." The man sighed. "You don't understand. That dog doesn't belong to you." Kaiser snarled, stepping protectively in front of Tom. The man smirked. "Still loyal. Good. You were trained well, weren't you, Kaiser?" Suddenly, Kaiser froze. His breathing changed, his ears twitched, and something flashed in his eyes. Memories. Flashes of dark warehouses, secret missions, dangerous men. He wasn't just any K9. He had been used for smuggling operations, trained to follow orders without question. But something had changed. Maybe he saw something he wasn't supposed to. Maybe he refused to obey. That's why they got rid of him. That's why they left him tied in the forest. He had escaped. And now, his return could expose everything. Tom saw it too, the realization in Kaiser's eyes. He knelt beside him, placing a hand on his back. "You remember, don't you?" Kaiser didn't blink. He understood everything now. The man in black took a step forward. "Enough of this. Take him." 2 men rushed forward. Before Tom could react, Kaiser leapt into action. One moment, he was still. The next, he was a force of nature. He lunged at the first man, knocking him to the ground with terrifying speed. The second barely had time to react before Kaiser's powerful jaws clamped onto his arm, dragging him down. Tom swung the pipe, hitting another attacker hard. They were outnumbered, but Kaiser fought like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Sirens wailed in the distance. Flashing red and blue lights lit up the night. The police were coming. The leader of the criminal ring cursed under his breath. This isn't over. Then, he disappeared into the darkness. As officers arrived, Kaiser stood beside Tom, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He had won. Tom looked at him and finally understood. Kaiser wasn't just a rescue. He was a survivor. And he had known the truth all along.